Well, thank you very much, Professor Martins, for the kind introduction, and thank you and the authorities of the University of Macau for this great honor that I will receive tomorrow when I will be receive the Doctor Honoris Causa degree from this great university. It's a great honor for me. I am very pleased to be here. I have been in China a number of times, starting before most of you were born. In 1981, I think, is the first time I came to China, but it is the first time I'm in Macau, and I am very happy to be here. Once again, thank you for the great honor and for the kind introduction. In April 23, 1937, early in the Spanish Civil War, Nazi airplanes under the command of General Franco bombed the city of Guernica in northern Spain. This is a small city of about 7,000 people, a civilian population, not any military target. That was the first time that in the history of warfare, a civilian population was intentionally bombed from the air, and 25% of the population died. About 1,750 people, including children, women, and men. The Republican government from Madrid, against which General Franco had raised in a coup d'etat, had commissioned before this event the great Spanish painter Pablo Picasso to paint a mural for a world exhibit that was going to take place in Paris in October of the year for the Spanish Pavilion. Picasso, hearing of the massacre, in a fury of creative energy, outlined this painting in just 12 days. It's a very large painting. It's nearly 23 meters long and nearly 8 meters long and 3 meters high. Well, I think you all would agree with me that this painter exists because somebody wanted to convey a message, namely the horrors of war, the inhumanity of humans to humans. And in the same way, you would agree with me that the watch exists because it has been designed to tell time by a watchmaker. And a car has been designed for transportation. Now, as you can see, we have here the letters of the English alphabet, A, B, C, D, and then the digits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, these are butterfly wings. Clearly, we could use these letters to write text in English or in Portuguese, and we could use the numbers to write, to make calculations, arithmetic calculations. But again, we would agree that that's not the reason why the butterfly wings have those patterns. In the same way that we can use a mountain for skiing, that's not the reason why this mountain exists, and we can use a river for navigation, but that's not the reason why the river exists. What about the human eye? The message that I want to convey to you today is that the human eye has something in common with the painting and the watch and the car, and has something in common with the butterfly wings and the mountains and the river. What it has in common with the painting and the watch and the car is if it were not for the purpose it serves, namely seeing, the eye would not have come to exist. It came to exist to serve a particular purpose. What it has in common with the butterfly wings and the mountains and the rivers is that it's the result of a natural product. It's natural processes. It's not the result of an intentional designer, as in the case of the painting or the watch or the car. The next step in my presentation will be to try to convince you that with these discoveries, that in distinguishing what role the nature plays in achieving design in organisms like in the design of the eye, science has provided religion with an explanation that before it didn't have, and has solved for religion, for at least some forms of religion. I'm thinking primarily of the monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, that it has solved a problem that theologians used to call the theodicy problem, how to explain the existence of evil in the world. So the conclusion is, to the question in the title, is conflict or concert? There is, in my view, no conflict between religion and science. There is concert. In fact, science supports some conclusions from religion rather than being antagonistic to them. There is a narrative in the history of ideas that says that science came about as a result of two major revolutions, the Copernican revolution and the Darwinian revolution. The Copernican revolution started in 1543 when Nicolae Copernicus, in the year of his death, published his book on the revolutions of the celestial bodies. This is the cover of his books. So the Copernican revolution, in this narrative, says consisted in removing the Earth from being the center of the universe, as it was thought at the time, and making of the Earth just one more planet among many that circulate around the sun. So here you have a drawing from a contemporary book, a German book of astronomy. You have in the center the Earth. Scientific books at that time and for 2 or 3 centuries more in the West were always written in Latin. Like nowadays, they tend to be written more often than not in English, but even more so. It was the language of science and philosophy. So this book was written in Latin, so when you see the word here, terra, is earth in Latin. So the Earth was thought to be the center of the universe, and then in this book you can see Mercury, Venus, then the Sun, Solis in Latin, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and eventually the constellations of the stars. Here you have a drawing by Copernicus that was published in his book, and he has the Sun in the middle, then Mercury, Venus, the Earth with the Moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the constellations of the stars. So in this narrative says that the Copernican revolution consisted in removing the Earth from being the center of the universe to being one more planet. In the same way, it is said the Darwinian revolution, the second of these important scientific revolutions, was contributed by Darwin, consisted in moving human beings, our species, from being the center of all the living world and becoming just one more species among many others. So here you have in a representation of his most famous book on the origin of a species, published in 1859, when Darwin was 50 years old. And here you have a modern representation of the history of organisms closely related to us. What this is telling us is that chimpanzees and humans have a common ancestor, in fact, about 7 million years ago. And then we all have a common ancestor with the gorillas, and so on with the rest of the living world. So humans are just one more species. That's the Darwinian revolution, according to this narrative of the history of ideas. Well, this narrative of the history of ideas is very unsatisfactory, because what it says is true, but it misses what is most important about these two revolutions. What these two revolutions are, together, they accomplished the beginning of science in the modern sense of the word. The Copernican revolution has to be seen in the context of some of his successors, of which I have highlighted here two, Galileo and Newton, who lived about 100 years apart of each other and from Copernicus, and here you have some representations of them. What the Copernican revolution consisted of was a commitment to the notion that the world consists of matter, the world that we experience with our senses, matter in motion, governed by natural laws. That there are laws that are universal, that apply on earth as well as in heaven, that can be discovered, they're usually simple, and they can be tested by observation and experiment. And I have put here two of the very simple laws. Force equals mass times acceleration, and the inverse square law of the distance, the attraction between two bodies is the result of the product of their masses, but this inversely is related to the square of the distance. This is what was important about the Copernican revolution, that the world can be explained as the result of natural laws of universal validity. Well, the Copernican revolution had left out organisms, animals and plants and other organisms, for reasons that were expressed traditionally by many religious authors and philosophers and others, but were very well articulated, better than ever before or afterwards, by an Englishman, William Paley, in a book called Natural Theology, published in 1802. William Paley was an Anglican, Christian Anglican minister, author of several books of theology. And just towards the end of his life, he wanted to summarize all the discoveries of biology, which had advanced considerably during the 18th century, in a book where he makes the argument again and again that organisms are clearly designed. We have eyes that have been designed to see, hands that are designed for grasping, and legs for walking, and so with the rest of our body and our functions. And he says, where there is design, there is a designer. And he says the only designer, possible designer of all the organisms in the world and the variety of species, and so numerous as they exist everywhere, the only possible designer has to be God. So he, in this book, makes an argument for the existence of God based on the design of the organisms. And one of the examples that he uses is the human eye. He starts the book, it's a beautiful book, it's beautifully written, it's only 300 pages or so. He starts the book by saying, assume that I am on a meadow and I'm walking with a friend, and accidentally I happen to kick a stone, and my friends ask me, where does the stone come from? Paley says, well, for all what I know, I could tell him may have been there forever. There's nothing to be explained. But assume that a few steps farther, we see a watch on the ground. And he asks me the same question, where does the watch come from? He says, clearly I cannot give the same answer. The watch is a complex object consisting of many parts, all put together in a precise way so that it can tell time, so that it can serve the function it does serve. So I have to say in that case, well, somehow, somewhere, there has been a watchmaker that makes the watch. So then starts to speak about the human eye and uses the same kind of argument as for the watch, saying, look at the human eye. It has a lens and a cornea and an iris and the retina and nerve and muscles and blood vessels all have to be put together in a precise way for the eye to function. So this is the evidence, he says, the existence of the creator, of God as the author of the design of organisms. And he uses examples from other animals and plants and the relationships between the sexes, male and female, and many other arguments, as I said, in a beautifully written book, where he articulates this argument that has been accepted traditionally, that creatures, animals and plants, have to be designed by God, by a creator, precisely because they have this very precise design. Well, it was the great accomplishment of Darwin that he was able to complete the Copernican revolution. That's what is important about the Darwinian revolution, that he extended to the living organisms the explanations of the world of nature as a consequence of matter in motion governed by natural laws. Natural laws that can be discovered, can be subject to observation and experiment, and that have general validity. Darwin extended the Copernican revolution to the living world, the most complex and most interesting realities in the world, and with that, he completed the Darwinian revolution, the Copernican and the revolution, by bringing now everything in the world of nature within the realm of science. So science, in the modern sense, starts with the Copernican revolution, but does not get consummated in its beginning until Darwin, when organisms are brought into the realm of science as well. His famous book, the one published in 1859, is called On the Origin of a Species by Means of Natural Selection. Those of you who have taken biology classes know that know that Darwin's book, I think I have some water here. You all know that Darwin's book is a book about evolution, right? Well, it's not a book about evolution. Darwin's Origin of a Species is a book about natural selection. He was planning to write a book with multiple volumes. He was working on it, to be titled Natural Selection. And he considered this book a summary of that longer book that he was writing and intended to publish. He didn't want to use the title Natural Selection, so he called it that, On the Origin of a Species by Means of Natural Selection. The book has 14 chapters. The first 8 chapters are exclusively about natural selection. And then at the beginning of chapter 9, he says, well, if my theory is correct, evolution must have occurred, but it must have occurred in a certain way. And then he has 2 chapters looking at geology as evidence of evolution, 2 chapters dedicated to biogeography as evidence of evolution, and 1 dedicated to what we call comparative anatomy and comparative embryology as evidence for evolution. And then the final chapter is again back to natural selection. What is important about these 5 chapters about evolution is that he is trying to prove that evolution occurs not like everybody was accepting it at the time. By the middle of 19th century, most biologists were accepting evolution. But accepted evolution very much following a theory that had been advanced by somebody called Lamarck, a French zoologist, who published in 1809 a book about the subject. It was precisely the year in which Darwin was born, 1809. And Lamarck argued that organisms are evolving and they are changing gradually and progressing and advancing and becoming more advanced and are changing in all relevant respects. And Darwin says if evolution happens by natural selection, it should not happen that way. Sometimes something in an organism will change, other parts will not change. Some organisms never change, even for millions of years, and he gives some examples, cases of organisms, particularly mollusks living in the ocean, that have lived under the same conditions for millions of years and therefore have not changed, because the argument of natural selection says that the organisms are changing in response to the environment. The environment changes in some ways in one place, in other ways in another place, and in some respects or other respects. So evolution should be a much more disconcerted, a process where things will happen at some time and other things will happen at other times, and some things never happen or never change. So the notion of natural selection actually is a very simple one, like many scientific discoveries. And at the beginning of the third chapter of the book, when he's starting to introduce the concept, he summarizes the concept as you see it here. He says, can it be thought improbable, seeing that variations useful to man have undoubtedly occurred? This phrase refers to chapter 1. The first chapter of the book is dedicated to what now we call artificial selection. Selection as it is practiced by farmers and animal breeders. Animal breeders get the cows that produce the more milk and get their progeny, and they try to create herds of cows that produce a lot of milk, or chicken that produce lots of eggs. And the same with plants. And farmers and animal breeders have been very successful over the centuries in producing wonderful crops and wonderful animal breeds. And what he's saying, seeing that variations useful to us happen in animals and plants, can it be thought improbable that other variations useful in some way to each being in the great and complex battle of life should sometimes occur? So if variations occur in animals and plants which are beneficial to us, there must be variations which are useful to themselves. And if such variations occur, can we doubt that individuals having any advantage, however slight, over others would have the best chance of surviving and of procreating their kind? If you have a bird with wings that are more effective at flying, when that variation arises in a species of bird, that variation is likely to be propagated because that bird will do better flying and will survive better and leave more progeny. Or a deer which is faster at running and therefore can avoid predators, or whatever animal or plant you want to think about. The case is clear, he says, that whenever something is useful to that plant or that animal, that useful thing, that useful variation, will be propagated over the generations. And that is how evolution happens, he says. So here you say, on the other hand, we may feel sure that any variation in the least degree injurious would be rigidly destroyed. This preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection. Very simple idea. Hereditary variations which are beneficial will multiply, will increase, and will replace variations which are less useful. Because nowadays we have a tremendous mathematical theory of natural selection with hundreds of theorems and thousands of papers written on theory, the theory of natural selection, thousands of papers and hundreds of books with showing experiments and evidence of all sorts. But for the rest of that book, then Darwin argues the concept first and explains why he thinks it should work, and then provides evidence for natural selection based, as I was telling you a moment ago, on evolution of various kinds of evidence, geology, biogeography, and comparative anatomy. Geology had come of age in the first half of the 19th century. One thing that had been discovered, and probably one of the most fundamental ones, was the strata which are seen on the Earth when some cut of the Earth happens on the surface of the Earth for whatever the reason, for erosion as in this case. This is the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River in the United States. What the geologists have discovered is these strata actually all have been formed at the bottom of the ocean. And in such a way, of course, that those which are up have been formed more recently than the ones which are at the bottom. When fossils are found, like they are found here, means that the ones at the bottom lived much earlier than the ones at the top. And they will show gradual succession of organisms through more than 1,000 million years. These sediments they're about nearly 2 kilometers high from the surface there to the river, and covered a little more than 1,000 million years of fossils. So it's a great place, but so are many others to study the evolution using geology or paleontology. And so scientists were able to reconstruct the history of organisms as represented in this example. This is a model drawing. The evolution of the horse that starts about 50 million years ago with an animal called Hyracotherium. It's about the size of a dog, and gradually changes in many ways, in size, the number of toes, and in many other ways. And very important, the point that he was making, and he makes again and again, that some parts change, some do not change, some change at different times than the others. And also, many species are arising continuously, and many species are becoming extinct. The way we evolutionists represent the origin of a new species is by having something like a tree with branches. When the new species arises, we represent it as a new branch. When it becomes extinct, the branch ends. So you see that at various times, there have been many species of horses until we come eventually to the modern horses. The contemporaries of Darwin, critics of Darwin's ideas, said, well, if evolution is a gradual process where one kind of organism eventually becomes another kind of organisms, where are the missing links? That was the expression that became popular. A chain is made of links, and they were arguing that in many of these important changes from one kind of organism to another, there were missing links. Well, here you have an example of a missing link which was found just 2 years after the publication of The Origin of a Species. It's a creature called Archaeopteryx, was found in what is today Bavaria in Germany, and it's quite clear that it has some features that are just like a small dinosaur, and some features which are just like a bird. The head is very much like a bird. It had wings, but the skeleton by and large is still like a small dinosaur. It was a small animal about the size of almost like a chicken or so. But since that fossil was found, actually 10 more fossils of this species have been found. The last one about 5 years ago. But in any case, what was important here, you have an organism intermediate between two different kinds of organisms, dinosaur, reptiles, and birds. In later editions of The Origin of a Species, Darwin cites this example. And I am going to show you a very recent discovery of an intermediate between fish and amphibians. Amphibians are the first tetrapods, the first vertebrates that have 4 limbs, as we do, and we come from amphibians. But amphibians came from fish, and up to 5 years ago, some fishes were known. They were able to move on shallow waters, move around, but were clearly still fishes, like these two here. And then there were some other animals that looked still quite a lot like fishes, but they were clearly already tetrapods. They have 4 limbs. And this creature, Acanthostega, lived about 375 million years ago. This one, Panderictis, about 385 million years ago. So some scientists from the University of Chicago went to an area of northern Canada called the Inuit Territory, where we could work only during the summer because the rest of the time is completely covered by ice, because they knew there were deposits which were 380 million years old. And they worked for 3 years, and eventually they found this animal Tiktaalik, which is intermediate between a fish and an amphibian as you can be. Well, the intermediates, the missing links that were of great interest to the contemporaries of Darwin as today are the intermediates between the apes and humans. Chimpanzees and humans have common ancestors. Where are those intermediates? Darwin died in 1882. No intermediate had been found. The ancestors in the human lineage, after it separated from the chimpanzee lineage, these are called hominids. So no hominids had been discovered by the time Darwin died in 1882. The first one was discovered in 1889, 7 years later, in Java. By now, there are thousands and thousands of intermediates that I am represented in a simplified manner here. So we start with these hominids with exotic names like Sahelanthropus svadensis that comes from the country called Chad, and others, and up to come into Homo sapiens. Our species came about only 150,000 years ago, but our lineage separated from the chimpanzees about 7 million years ago. And now we have a very good succession of these species. And as Darwin had predicted, the change from being ape-like to being human-like happens in different parts of the body at different times. And now we do know that of the two most conspicuous differences between us and apes, one is that the apes walk in what is called knuckle walking. They walk resting on the knuckles of the arms, and therefore they need very long arms and a very long hip. And the other very conspicuous difference is the brain. Our brain is about 4 times larger than that of a chimpanzee or a gorilla. Now we know that the bipedal gait, the fact that we don't walk on our fours, but we walk on 2 feet, that change happened very early in hominid evolution. The enlargement of the brain happened much later. So here you have all these creatures up to Homo habilis. Homo habilis lived about 2 million years ago. This is the first one who starts to have larger brain. But all these other ones had still very small brains, like the size of a brain of a chimpanzee, but yet they were bipedal. We know that they were bipedal from very early studies. Some of the first fossils of these hominids that were discovered include Australopithecus afarensis, this species which lived about 3.5 million years ago. And Australopithecus afarensis, in one case, was represented by the skeleton of a relatively young woman, adult woman, but young, which they named Lucy. 40% of the skeleton was found put together. So it was at the time the most important hominid discovery made. And here you have the bones of Lucy. And here you have the hip bone. And I want just to look at it for a moment, because I'm going to compare it with the hip of a modern human and the hip of a gorilla or a chimpanzee. Lucy, this of course has been reconstructed as a drawing, but this is the shape that we can see from the bones that Lucy's hip bone was. It was much smaller than the human one, because Lucy was only about this high, just about 1 meter. But it's clear that with a hip like that, Lucy could not walk the way gorillas and chimpanzees walk. This is the knuckle walking. She had to walk like this. So we knew now for many years that bipedal gait, walking on 2 feet, happened very early in human evolution, but the brain didn't start to enlarge until 2 million years ago with Homo habilis, and then very gradually became very large. There are several other sources of evidence for evolution. The most convincing evidence for evolution and the best way to reconstruct the history of living organisms today is through a discipline, biological discipline, that did not exist in Darwin's time, what is called molecular biology. With molecular biology, we study proteins and DNA. DNA is the hereditary material. Proteins are the molecules that run all the living processes, and they are determining the composition by DNA. The third one for a horse. And where there is a difference, I have highlighted that in color. So if you look at the human and monkeys, they are identical, the molecules everywhere, except at this position here, but yet differ by 11 molecules, 11 components, or 12 with respect to the horse. So even if we don't know anything else about the evolution of humans, monkeys, and horses, and we knew enough about it, but this is to demonstrate how the method would work. The fact that there is only one difference between humans and monkeys, and 12 or 11 between humans and monkeys and horses, means that humans and monkeys have had a much more recent ancestor there than they had with the horse. And moreover, then the difference between the humans and the monkeys happened in the human lineage, not in the monkey lineage. And we know that because in that difference that I highlighted between humans and monkeys, monkeys are identical to horses and most other animals. So the change must have happened in the human lineage. We need not go into great detail into how human evolution is reconstructed, but in this paper of 1967, with a tiny molecule, these scientists, two scientists, Walter Fitch and Emmanuel Margoliouth, were able to reconstruct the evolution of organisms going from the ancestor, the common ancestor of yeast and animals about 2 billion years ago, to the common ancestor of insects and vertebrates, and then to various vertebrates. So reconstructed a lot of evolutionary history, 2 billion years, with just a tiny molecule. The power of molecular evolutionary studies is that we have thousands of genes, of DNA molecules, and thousands of proteins. So we can, and all of them record the same evolutionary history, because all they come with the same organisms, so that we can start to study one molecule, and if we want to have more details, we do another one and another one. So one protein, another protein, another protein, or one fragment of DNA, one gene and another gene and another gene. So nowadays, this may surprise you, at least some of you, we can reconstruct the evolutionary history of living organisms with as much detail and as much precision as we want. It's all a matter of investing time and resources, time and money. And indeed, scientists now have reconstructed the evolution of the living world, which includes the bacteria, a group of organisms, archaea, which are of recent discovery, and then the eukaryotes, which include animals, fungi, and plants. Well, I want to move now briefly to what is the second part and the final part of the talk, which is the explanation of William Paley of the design of organisms, and the explanation that has been advanced again in recent times by some people. Some of them call themselves creationists. Some of them are proponents of what they call intelligent design. And they are reviving the argument of William Paley, saying, you know, when you look at the eye, that cannot have come by natural selection. See, the difference between these authors and Paley is that Paley was before Darwin. He didn't know about natural selection. These authors know about natural selection, but they argue, you see, natural selection, as Darwin explained and as modern evolutionists know, and happens one little step at a time, one little variant at a time. But if you look at the human eye, unless you have everything put together at the same time, the eye does not function. So it cannot have come about gradually. So what I want to tell you about these proponents of intelligent design and their theory is summarized here, that the critique they make of evolution is wrong. That what they say that natural selection cannot produce something like the eye is wrong. Second, that there is no scientific content to what they are arguing. Some are pretending to be doing science, but there is no scientific discovery or contribution of any kind. Last, and most important in many ways, from the point of view of this lecture and the point of view of many people of faith, people who are Christians or Muslims or Jews or other religious people, that intelligent design, this theory, is contrary to religion, while evolution is not. So, because intelligent design implies that God is incompetent, that God is cruel, and it amounts to a blasphemy. So, very briefly, the critique of evolution, that the natural selection cannot produce something like the human eye, one little step at a time. Here you have the statement made by the only among these proponents of intelligent design who is a bona fide biologist. He's a professor of biochemistry. He's not an evolutionist at a university in the United States, Lehigh University. And he says that how do we confidently detect design when a number of separate interacting components are ordered in such a way as to accomplish a function beyond the individual components. They have to be all together there or it doesn't work. That's what he's saying. Well, let us look at the human eye to see whether that is true. To understand how the human eye came about, we can look, we don't have to look at fossils, we could do something of the kind, but we can look at animals that have an eye very similar to ours, which is called the camera eye, an eye that has all these parts like our eye does. And that is found, I don't know if you are aware of it, in squids and octopus. Among mollusks, mollusks are a very diversified group of organisms, much older than the vertebrates. We are vertebrates, and much more diverse. They have more species. And moreover, many of them have lived in environments that have not changed over time. So we can find in mollusks all the developments of stages of the development of the eye coming to the human eye version of a mollusk, which is what we find in an octopus or a squid. Here you have a mollusk that lives in, I'm sure you can find this in some of the rocks in the intertidal, in this part of the world. These creatures are called limpets, and in Spanish, lapas. I suspect the Italian word may be similar because they are little mollusks. They have shells which are cylindrical, conical, with the base being about as large as the fingernail of my big thumb. And they are on the rock. And if you look very carefully when the tide is down, you can see that they are moving. And what they are doing is grazing. They are eating the microscopic algae that have been brought by the tide. When the tide comes, of course, they attach themselves to the rock with great strength. You try to pick them up even when the tide is down. I mean, you see them moving, you try to grab one of them, they attach themselves to the rock so strongly that you cannot pick them up. It's impossible. You have to use a knife and remove them very slowly. All what these animals need to know is whether the tide is down or the tide is on. Because if the tide is on, it's over, that means that they have to attach themselves to the rock to avoid being taken by the waters down to the open ocean, because they will die there. They don't have any way to survive there. So if the tide is down, that means that they can start to eat all these little things, the little foods that the tide has brought in. So all what they need to see is whether there is light or no light. There's no need more eye than that. This is all what they have of an eye. A few cells with pigments and some nerve fibers that detect whether there is light or not. Then you have another mollusk called a slit shell, these mollusks, I don't know the name in Chinese, or for that matter in Portuguese. In English, it's slit shells, but I don't know what they are. I think you should know here, as we know in Spain and Portugal, because it's a mollusk that we eat. The word in Spanish is navaja, pocket knife. They are elongated like this, look like a pocket knife, and in fact, the animal gets out by separating the two sides of the shell. Well, here you have an eye slightly more complicated, but not much more. You have more nerve cells, and now in the shape of a cup with more connections, as I said, through the nerve cells to the brain. Then Nautilus. This is a snail, but a snail that lives in the open ocean. And this is a snail that Darwin used as an example of an animal that had not changed for millions of years. He knew that, by the way. You have several shells of this animal, Nautilus, in the aquarium that is near the museum, the Science Museum that is here. I was seeing them this morning. You see a slightly more complex eye, but still very simple. But now you see the traces of retina and more nerve cells, and then another marine snail, and finally the octopus with all the parts that we have in the human eye, the same. So as complex as our eye. So you see that eye is very complex, but that doesn't mean that could not come by natural selection one step at a time. Intelligent design criticism of evolution is wrong. But what they say that is scientific theory is not science. When they started to propose this theory in the early 1990s, and they said they were going to make many discoveries. One of the proponents, Philip Johnson, a retired professor from Berkeley, said, give us 5 or 10 years, and you will see scientific breakthroughs biologists had not dreamed of before ID, intelligent design. 1998, 5 years went by, 10 years went by, not a single discovery. More important, and just to end, intelligent design, these ideas of creationism, in the way I see them, these theories, they are contrary to religion because of the implications. And the implications are that, first of all, come from the fact that intelligent design is not the way the organisms are designed. ID, they represent intelligent design as ID. If we use ID, we should use it to talk about imperfect design, not intelligent design. And here I have 3 examples of very imperfect design. One which may seem trivial, but is not quite trivial, the human jaw, which is not big enough for the teeth. So we have the wisdom teeth extracted, and the other teeth sometimes have to be straightened or are crooked because the jaw is not big enough. We know why that is the case. In the human evolution that I was telling you about 2 million years ago, the brain started to increase. As the brain started to increase, for the child to be able to pass through the birth canal of the mother, something had to get smaller. What started to get smaller was the jaw. The jaw of a gorilla or chimpanzee is much larger than ours. So evolution started to favor a smaller jaw. As the jaw got smaller, the teeth had to get smaller also. But the selective pressure, natural selection was working on the brain. And these other pressures were secondary. That's how natural selection works. So that's why we have an imperfect jaw relative to the teeth we have. You know, if a human engineer would have designed the human jaw, he would be fired the next day. And the activity in this design to God, and then of course the birth canal of women, which is not big enough for the head to pass, so that over centuries and millennia, since the beginning of humankind, millions of innocent children and millions of mothers have died because of this defective design of the birth canal not being big enough for the head. Again, we know the reason why the problem exists, namely that the brain was being favored as our ancestors were becoming more and more intelligent, so the brain was growing very fast. The birth canal of women, when we compare it, say, with the birth canal of Lucy, even correcting for age, is larger, so it has become larger. But the selective pressure was on the brain, not on the birth canal, so that's why we still have this conflict between the two. There are also in nature all sorts of cruelties and sadistic behaviors. I mean, parasites exist by just destroying their hosts. It would imply that God, if they were the result of God's design, that does create some creatures just to destroy others, with, in the case of parasitism, and also the cruelty that exists with predators. That's why I have a book which is called Darwin's Gift to Science and Religion. Darwin's discovery was a great discovery of natural selection, and all what came afterwards was a great contribution to science because it completed the Copernican revolution, as I said. But it was also a great gift to religion because it helped to solve the problem the theologians call theodicy problem. Why there is evil in the world, particularly as it refers to these matters of the defects of the human body, of the human physiology, or the cruelty and sadism that exist in the natural world. Let me end with one very extreme case of defective design. We have genes, as you know, DNA, and in the formation of the sex cells, whether sperms in humans or eggs, sperm in men or eggs in women, these genes recombine. But recombine in a process which is a mess. So badly designed that 20% of all conceptions, of all pregnancies, 20% end on a spontaneous abortion. As you may know, women tend to know these things better than men during the first 2 months of pregnancy. The reproductive system of humans so badly designed that 20% of all pregnancies end in spontaneous abortion, and they want to blame God for the design of humans and the design of the reproductive system. There are about 100 million births per year in the world, so that means 20 million abortions. They want to attribute them to God's defective design. That's why I said sometimes that intelligent design amounts to blasphemy. And that's also why I say that Darwin's gift to religion is natural selection. It was a gift to science, but it was a gift to religion because it made it possible to attribute these defects of the living world not to the design of God, but to the results of natural selection, a natural process. Natural process doesn't need to end in good things, and that's why we have all the defects we have. The problem arises when we attribute them to the design of God. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ayala, for your lecture. Now we come to the Q&A section. May we invite Professor Hu Madinch, Vice Rector of the University of Macau, to be the moderator of this section.
Thank you very much, Professor Ayala. So I think that we have some time for a Q&A. So any questions? Yes, it's better to have. One question over there, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ayala, for your great speech. I have a question. That in your speech, you issue that science and religion can live in harmoniously, and it can live in together. And you also cited that science, the evolution, is a gift of Darwin to the religion. But I have no idea in your speech that how science and religion can live harmoniously. You know, the fact is a fact. When we make do some decision making, we will depend on the science or the religion. If you face in some occasions, you will think, oh, you do it follows as a science or follows as a Bible. So it may be a conflict. So how do you thinking about this kind of things?
Well, the conflict exists among people who try to interpret the Bible as if the Bible were a textbook of astronomy or biology. That is, they read the Bible for scientific, natural facts. And the Bible was not written for that purpose. The Bible was written to tell us about our relationship with God and with each other and about moral values and the like. And what I am saying is not new. I mean, you go to the very beginning of Christianity, the Christian tradition, and already the early commentators of the Bible pointed out St. Augustine, who lived around the year 400, 30 years before and afterwards, wrote famously a commentary on the book of Genesis. That is the title. And this is one of the first things that he says, that the purpose of the Bible is not, of the book of Genesis in particular, is not to teach us how the heavens were made, but how to go to heaven. It might surprise some of you that at that time already there was an argument whether the earth was the center of the universe or whether it was sitting somewhere and other planets and the stars were moving around, or whether it was some other combination. Some people thought that the whole universe was a flat plate, be that as it may. St. Augustine says, the Bible is not going to solve that problem. The Bible is not written to tell us about how the heavens were made, but about how to go to heaven. And that has been consistent throughout most of the Christian and Jewish and Islamic tradition, and tend to be people who are not really experts in biblical knowledge, and they are not good theologians, the ones who develop these arguments that the Bible contradicts what science says. The Bible, once again, is not a book about science. It's a book about our relationship with God and the relationships with humans to each other and the values that we should observe, and other things of that kind. If one then looks at the Bible only for those truths, religious truths, then there is no opposition with science. But theologians had in the back of their minds all along for centuries the problem of theodicy, because they believed that God had designed the world more or less as it is described in the Bible. So if that is the case, how do we explain the presence of evil in the world, and particularly in the living world? And that's what Darwin solved.
Thank you for your answer, but I'm still in the confused that you just told me that there's something when dealing with people relationships, you follow the Bibles, or some things about people and heaven, you should follow Bibles and religions theory. But when you take some reality stuff, you follow the science or some reliable things. But sometimes the things are in common, when we if sometimes the beginning of the Bible, the God told us they created everything, but science said it's not the truth.
Yeah. Okay, let me just, so that we don't carry this, give opportunity to other people to speak.
Yeah.
You look at take the beginning of the Bible. Let me tell you why St. Augustine, like all the commentators, the enlightened commentators of the Bible, theologians, don't want the Bible to be interpreted literally. Chapter 1 of Genesis starts, this is how God created the world. In the beginning, God made the light, and then God keeps doing other things in different days. Fourth day, God created the sun. St. Augustine says, fourth day, God created the sun, and we had light before. Where did it come from? So he knows that cannot be right. And then on the sixth day, God creates man and woman man and woman. He created them. Repeat the thing, the verse. You go to chapter 2, and starting on verse 4, there is another narrative of the creation of the world. This is how God created the world. And in that narrative, God creates man, the male, one male first, before God creates animals and plants or anything else. Eventually, he creates plants and has a garden, and obviously Adam is still born there, so God creates the animals, and he tells Adam to name the animals, and in one day, Adam names all the species in the world, and he's still born, so to speak. And then God comes to the solution of the problem. Of course, what he needs is a woman. So he puts him to sleep, takes a rib, and out of the rib makes a woman. So chapter 1, men and women are created at the same time after creating everything else. Chapter 2, man is created first, then everything else, and then woman at the end. Which one of the two narratives is true? Well, they cannot be literally true in the way that we interpret the book of science. They are true if what we look for the religious truth. The religious truth is the same in both, that we are creatures of God, and that all humans have a single origin. Very important at times when people discriminated one race against the other and the like. So if the Bible is taken literally, it destroys itself.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Please, here.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. We know that Albert Einstein also once said, science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. So how do you interpret or understand this lame and blind in your understanding? Yeah, thank you.
Well, like many sayings of wisdom, I mean, they're trying to convey a message. I think what Einstein is trying to tell us there is the religion is a source of inspiration and values, and it is true, that's where it comes from. But it's good to have science, because science gives us knowledge. But ultimately, he was arguing we need also religious faith and religious values so that we can have a rich human life.
Any other questions? Yeah, please. No, you have the microphone over there. Yes, yeah.
I believe, Stephen Jay Gould, I believe, has challenged the theory of evolution for all sorts of complex reasons. I don't think it's the theory of design, however, that is his argument. And I would like to know if there are other reasons that scientists have alleged against the theory of evolution, and there are no other arguments that you think can in any way infirm the theory?
Well, first of all, what you are saying is absolutely wrong.
Yes.
Steve Gould didn't challenge the theory of evolution. He was an evolutionist, and he tried to modify the current theory in an important way, which is that, namely, that there are long periods of time, but no change occurs. And then change occurs for a long time. Steve Gould and I were classmates at Columbia University when we both were getting our PhDs, and we were good friends and were very good friends to the end of his life. I don't know whether you know this name. He was a geologist, very brilliant geologist, and particularly a great communicator. He wrote many books about evolution, and which are translated into many languages. He wanted to say something original, and I told him, well, writing in science, Steve, what do you mean that evolutionary theory should be modified to accept there are periods that when there is no change? It's all in Darwin. So he said, well, blah, blah, blah. So he didn't argue against the theory of evolution. Quite on the contrary, he was a great proponent of the theory of evolution. And although he was a self-proclaimed atheist, or rather agnostic, He used to say he himself, an agnostic is an atheist on Sunday clothing. But anyway, he argued very much for somewhat along the lines of what I have argued today, that religion and science deal with different subjects and that should be seen as complementary, even if he was not a religious person.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? One more over there.
There's one
please.
there.
Over there, please.
Hello, Professor Ayala, and thank you very much for the speech today. I'm very interested in this topic. I've attended some other seminars before where some experts and scientists try to debate if God ever exists. I would like to hear your take on that. Do you believe God exists? And if so, what kind of God exists? Like, is it the God from the Catholic or Buddhism or Muslim? There are many gods that people are talking about. So I'd like to hear that.
Yeah. Well,
Thank you.
the answer is simply that I am not here as a theologian to elaborate on the concept of God, but as a scientist talking about science and making the point that science is compatible with religion. But it's not up to me to provide definitions of God. The theologians are very good at doing that.
Okay. One question over there, the last row, in the last row. Over there, in last row.
And thanks for the lecture. And I have one question. And do you agree with the position that when we talk about religion, by talking about religion, we mean some text or moral beliefs, moral guidelines that started in the past, trying to explain the world, explain why we are humans, why we are here, and now we have scientific knowledge that can explain more scientifically how we evolved from the past. So, and from my view, religion context is quite social. It was used to manipulate people. It was used to control the society, to provide moral guidelines. And now, I think those useful to some extent, so we should not extend now the religion part of giving an explanation to the world. We should not extend that explanation to undermine our scientific efforts. What do you think of this position? Well, if it's right, is it true that there hasn't been any conflict? So the conflict is not about who is true or was wrong or was not wrong. It's about some social conflict that in the past some scientists was suppressed by the church. So now some scientists don't feel good and trying to work against that force from religious authorities. And I would like to have your views on that.
Well, the notion that science has replaced religion, because religion was used to provide explanations of the natural world, and now we have explanations from science, is one way of explaining sort of history of ideas. But I think that's precisely the way of explaining the history of ideas that leads to conflict. The Bible, and perhaps theologians and philosophers, sometimes have used images about the physical world and the living world because they have to talk about those things. And that's why the Bible, trying to tell the humans that we are creatures of God, had to use to refer to animals and plants and humans and men and women and the like. So it's, the religion was using science, if you want to call it that, as natural explanations, which now we know they are wrong, not because they were wrong, because they were using simply religious authorities the knowledge that people had at the time. Now, the knowledge has now replaced by science, but I don't see why that should replace religion. Let me tell you one way in which I think one can look at the matter. Okay, so now we know, you know, and I know, that we were conceived in our mother's womb, little ovum was fertilized by sperm, and there was one cell divided into two, into four, and eventually, a little baby comes out, and then you keep eating as I do, and we transform food into our own bodies. And so there's a natural process in the development of an individual from conception to childhood, adulthood, to the end of life. There's a natural explanation of the human life. There is no reason for a person who accepts the natural explanation, scientific explanation if you want, to exclude the religious explanation. A person who, like you and me, who know that to be the case, can still be religious and worship God and accept, the commandments of, like the Ten Commandments, or the versions of behavior that some of the religions promote. So I don't think the two are incompatible. The fact that we have now scientific explanation for some things doesn't mean that we should exclude, therefore, religion at all. I think the two remain compatible, as I tried to illustrate in the example of what happens, how do we see ourselves as individuals, products of natural process, but still we can see ourselves as being religious and accepted the existence of God and the presence of God in the world.
Okay. Any more questions? So, one question over there, please.
Thank you, Professor Ayala. I think centered to religion is that we humans have a soul. But according to the theory of evolution, when we are just descendants of animals from the natural selection, then we don't necessarily have to have a soul. So we humans, do we have souls or not? Thank you.
Okay, so the soul, the notion of the soul, as in Christianity, is a spiritual component of human life. And science has nothing to say about the soul, whether it exists or not, and it has nothing to say about whether God exists or not. Those things are beyond the subject of science, which therefore, for a person of faith, we may have a soul. Now, from the evolutionary point of view, some issues arise concerning the soul for people who believe that humans have soul. If we evolved from non-human ancestors, the hominids, after are separated from our lineage, from the lineage that goes to the chimpanzees, at what time our ancestors started to have souls? Well, again, that's not a scientific question. It's a religious question. But I don't see it myself as a problem, because it seems to me that and I should clarify again that I'm not here as a theologian, but as a scientist. But it seems to me that the same problem arises, if one wants to see it as a problem, in the development of the individual. You have the egg, conceived, fertilized egg in the womb of the mother, and then the cell divides and divides and divides and divides, and eventually you have a human individual. At what point, for a person of faith who believes in the existence of the soul, at what point the soul comes into the body? So sometime, certainly science is not going to provide the answer, as it is not going to provide the answer when in evolution the soul started to appear, because those are not scientific questions. But the problem is not different for evolution as it is for the individual.
Thank you very much. I think that we are arriving to an end. But I just have one question also, which is the following. You talk about this natural selection, and you talk about intelligent design. And so you say that evolution is through this natural selection, but we are talking about natural selection. But as you know, this research by humans also, and as we talked before about the stem cell research and so on. So the human might evolve not by natural but artificial selection in the future. So this will be a kind of design by humans. So how do you interpret the future in this way?
That's a fascinating question, and I'm going to answer it very briefly. It deserves another lecture, so invite me next year, and I will give you the lecture. The way I will answer it is the following. First, we know that biological evolution continues in humans, and the natural selection continues. And then people ask me, so where is human evolution going? Well, first, I don't know, because in evolution we cannot predict the future. Second, it's unimportant. Human evolution unimportant, yes, because you see, we no longer evolve by adapting our genes to the environment. We now evolve, adapt to the environment, adapting the environment to the genes. You know, this sounds like a play of words, it's not. You know, we appear, our species appeared about 150,000 years ago in Africa as a tropical animal. We are still tropical animals. We know the kind of temperatures that exist here in Macau or in tropical Africa or in the tropics in general, about 25 degrees centigrade for our physiology to work. Our physiology does not work at much warmer temperatures or much colder temperatures. And yet humans have colonized Alaska and Scandinavia and Siberia. It's not because the people who live there have a physiology that has changed that allows them, their physiology to function in cold weather. It's because they create the temperatures that we need. So they are through clothing and housing and other ways, fire or heating and cooling, we are creating the environment which suits our genes. This one can call cultural evolution, evolution by the creations of the human mind, which happens at a scale so much faster than biological evolution. The biological evolution for humans has become trivial. Let me, to make the case in a different way, you know, we fly much better than any bird. But we don't have wings, and we have the genes and the physiology of a bird. We travel through the rivers and seas and oceans better than any fish. We don't have gills and we don't have fins. We do that by inventing airplanes and flying airplanes and inventing boats and using boats. We are adapting the environment. In whatever environment we are, whether it's the ocean or the air or it is Siberia or Alaska, we are adapting the environment so that it fits the needs of our body. But it is a very interesting question, and indeed deserves a lecture sometime in the future.
Okay. Thank you very much. So can we have an applause to Professor Ayala? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ayala and Professor Matinch. The talk has now come to an end. Once again, please join us to give a big applause to Professor Ayala.
Thank you. Thank you.
We would also like to thank all for coming. Have a nice weekend.